こんばんは。京都学の母校京都大学にお招きいただきありがとうございます。安倍先生、藤田先生にお礼申し上げます。そして皆さん本日はお越しいただきありがとうございます。今日ここでお話できて光栄です。ただ日本語では英語での発表になることをご了承ください。それでは始めさせていただきます。So let me now switch to English so that you can understand me. Thank you so much for the very kind introduction. So I was asked to present something to a non-philosophical audience, even though I think that many of you are from philosophy. So I was thinking about what might be a good topic, and in a way this presentation can be understood as extending a little bit of what Abe Sensei, Matthias Fritsch and I have been doing together, namely thinking about nature, in a way also time and responsibility in a context that draws on different cultural traditions. So we see here, we find at least the responsibility part and the nature part, and I will be comparing and contrasting, but also showing similarities between different conceptions of wisdom, human as well as animal wisdom in this talk. So the outline of this talk is as follows. Since the title of this lecture requires some explanation, let me begin by speaking a little bit about human wisdom as limit consciousness first. I will be going back to perhaps the most classical text from Western philosophy where the wisdom concept of wisdom was being developed, namely Socrates' Apology, and then in the discuss what wisdom means there, namely a certain kind of limit consciousness, or what I will call a minimal conception of wisdom, which I think has certain promising parts, but I will also be criticizing this in the second part of this lecture, where then I will look at the role of animal wisdom. So, and I will be giving a big, far too big panorama of different images of animal wisdom that we find in Western, not only philosophy, but also literature as well as art. So I will also be drawing on a couple of artworks. So if you don't understand me, then hopefully at least these artworks will be appealing to you. And then in the third part of the lecture, I will be discussing so-called wisdom animals in the Taoist classic Zhuangzi, one of the two most famous Taoist texts, and look at the function that animals have, in my opinion, in this very important text from the Chinese philosophical canon. And finally, I will return to the beginning, as it were, and briefly raise the question concerning the relationship between human and animal wisdom. So from its inception, at least in the classical European tradition, the wisdom that the philosopher, that means a certain kind of human being, longs for, has been presented by way of a comparison. Socrates, who in a way both embodied wisdom and invented the discourse about what it might mean to be a wise person, proposes a specific manner of approaching wisdom, or Sophia, in the dialogue The Apology. We need to keep in mind that Socrates is speaking to us through the words given to him by his student Plato, of course. After being proclaimed to be the wisest person in Athens by the Oracle of Delphi, Socrates tries to disprove the oracle by going around Athens to find human beings who are wiser than him. He compares himself to others to determine whether the oracle, in contrast to his self-proclaimed opinion, might be right after all. By going around the city of Athens and testing the wisdom of politicians, poets, as well as craftsmen, highly recognized professions at the time, Socrates exposes that while there is occasional genius to be found in, for example, the beauty of a work of art, the skill of a craftsman, or the sense of power that a politician has, the claim to wisdom of these people exercising these respective professions turns out to be at best narrow. They might be knowledgeable in specific domains, but this is not quite the same as being wise. The claim by any of the politicians, poets, and craftsmen that they are wise is a sign of mere presumptuousness and vanity, of overstepping the domain of what they indeed do know. If anything, they inhabit islands of knowledge that they mistakenly consider to be more than islands. What distinguishes Socrates' ironic wisdom from the other contenders for wisdom is his paradoxical awareness of the limits of what he knows. Thus, Socrates states in the perhaps most well-known statement in the history of Western philosophy, in the words given to him by his student Plato, "I know that I don't know," or more accurately, "I do not think I know what I do not know." In the Socratic tradition, human wisdom consists in a form of knowledge that is aware of its own limits. We can call it a minimalist account of wisdom that is distinguished from other accounts of wisdom, for example, having profound insights into the nature of reality or a particularly good sense of judgment. From Socrates' minimalist definition, we can already see that, as simple as it may appear, wisdom is a rather complex issue. Arguably the highest of virtues, a person of wisdom has a specific kind of self-awareness. What distinguishes wisdom from other forms of awareness and knowledge is that it includes a consciousness of the limits of one's knowledge. More broadly speaking, wisdom consists in the self-reflective capacity of putting one's present standpoint, or one's perspective, including one's most considered convictions, values, and judgments, into perspective. The person who is wise knows about the limits of his knowledge without thereby necessarily claiming to possess a different kind or a higher form of knowledge. In this sense, wisdom is an awareness of a limit and presupposes a shift in self-consciousness. Negatively stated, the wise person is someone who breaks with the all-too-human tendency of considering his respective convictions, beliefs, or skills to be absolutely true, universally applicable, and of ultimate importance. In contrast, the wise person acknowledges that her way of viewing the world is not the only game in town. She acknowledges the contingency and finitude of her beliefs when compared to other possible forms of wisdom. In other words, the wise person decenters her perspective on the world, including her own position in this world, with regard to other possible perspectives and alternative centers. The capacity for putting her way of viewing the world into perspective can only be accomplished in light of one's awareness of the existence or possible existence of other perspectives, both actual, possible, and imagined ones. By putting her perspective into perspective, the person of wisdom engages in a paradoxical task. The more she knows about what she does not know, just as an increasing diameter of a circle corresponds to an increase of the empty area bordering its circumference. Wisdom understood as limiting one's claim to knowledge by imagining other alternative perspectives comes in different degrees and shapes, and is not an all or nothing affair. Philosophers in particular have a complex relationship to wisdom. By definition, as seekers of wisdoms, they do not claim to be wise. Yet they cannot be fully ignorant of wisdom either, or they would not be philosophers. Claiming to have wisdom, just as being immune to wisdom's lure, would be a sign of philosophical failure. Moreover, it would be an existential failure for the philosophical form of human life. The philosopher crucially depends on a constitutive tension to wisdom. She has to aim or desire for wisdom as the highest good, while also keeping distance from the arrogance of claiming to have achieved or reached wisdom. Claiming to be wise, or even claiming to be a philosopher, disqualifies this claim and means that one commits a performative contradiction. For these reasons, Socrates thus needed the priestess Pythia to call him wise and his student Plato to tell us about this founding myth of Western philosophy in an even more indirect manner. One crucial feature that has accompanied philosophy from its inception is this limit consciousness. In contemporary terminology, one could speak of a second-order awareness that supervenes on and alters the status of primary beliefs, desires, and convictions of someone aspiring to wisdom. The question emerges whether the second-order awareness or second-order skepticism is not purchased for the price of adopting new forms of blindness. And in a way, this talk will be could also be entitled The Philosopher's Blindness, because the rest of the talk is trying to deconstruct Socrates' project as I introduced it. Socrates' blind spot is that he considers his mission from a perspective that takes it all too seriously, a matter of life and death. Taking the philosophical quest for wisdom a bit too far, he willfully stages the acceptance of his death sentence given to him by the city of Athens as resulting from his unconditional commitment to searching for wisdom. He thereby negates the inherent ambivalence that characterizes philosophy's flirt with wisdom. To quote Theodor W. Adorno, a member of the Frankfurt School that Abe Sensei mentioned in the beginning, philosophy is the most serious of things, but then again, it is not that serious. Socrates' quest was not only too serious, but also a provocation. Nobody would like to be exposed to a philosopher, even to Socrates, recommendation that one is not really wise. Claiming to understand the limits of your knowledge better than others can also be a form of pretentiousness and arrogance. This kind of philosophical hubris, blind spot, or pretense can be seen and potentially addressed by decentering human wisdom in comparison to other forms of non-human wisdom. We have already stated at the outset that wisdom is a comparative notion in which the person comes to be aware of the limits of his perspective. Drawing such a limit requires an awareness of an outside of one's perspective. This raises the question, what is outside of the limits of Socrates' wisdom? I will suggest in this talk that wisdom understood as a limit consciousness requires comparing the human perspective to a perspective that is significantly different, even though there are certain similarities, from what is merely human. The limit of wisdom becomes particularly visible, or the limit of human wisdom becomes particularly visible, I will suggest during the second part that I will turn to now of this talk, when comparing human wisdom to that of animals. Socrates already distinguishes human wisdom from other forms of wisdom. The Oracle of Delphi, which was communicated to the priest Pythia by way of snakes, mentions that human wisdom is worth little or nothing. This diminishing of human wisdom to something in between little and nothing raises the question what other forms of non-human wisdom there might be and what kind of claims they make. And for this talk, I presuppose that Socrates was not primarily thinking of divine wisdom. Socrates himself does not explain what these other forms of wisdom are, but he does give us a clue. In the following section, I will approach the topic what wisdom might be, not by pursuing the Socratic comparison between the wisdom of the philosopher and the wisdom of other forms of human life, but by turning to the animal, or rather particular representations of animal wisdom instead. So the method I will be drawing on, and actually the inspiration I will be drawing on, is a little book that was published from the Blumenberg archives. So Professor Abe mentioned I first studied in Münster in Germany, and the main philosopher there, even though he died when I arrived, was Hans Blumenberg. And he is very well known for tracing different metaphors and arguing that we think by way of using certain metaphors that cannot be absolutely translated into non-metaphorical language. He interestingly also applied this approach to lions. And so I very much enjoyed reading this little book that was published out of his Nachlass about lions. And here I will not be speaking about lions, but I will be speaking mostly about birds. But in the background is this Blumenberg approach to metaphors as having certain functions in explaining to us the world in different ways than mere concepts might do. If my intuition is right, animals embody different ways of seeing and existing in the world. Socrates himself gives an important clue that reveals the importance of animal metaphors when it comes to the difficult task of approaching wisdom. Not rarely is he dressed in rags and presented as the inspiration for the dog philosophers that came to be known as the philosophical school of the Cynics afterwards. Interestingly, Socrates himself identifies himself as a gadfly, an annoying insect that, in spite of its small size, irritates and itches. Athens is compared to a somewhat oversized and sluggish horse in need of the right amount of philosophical irritation. Animals have been surprisingly present in reflecting on wisdom in European literary and philosophical traditions, as well as in the arts. It has been common to refer to animals as symbols of wisdom. Birds, and especially the owl, take on particular prominence here, of course, and I think maybe half of the philosophy departments in the world use the owl as its symbol. The owl accompanies the goddess of wisdom, Athena in Greece, and her syncretic incarnation, Minerva, in Roman mythology. Athena and the owl were imprinted on ancient coins, such as the Athenian tetradrachm, which we see here at the bottom, which is also referred to as glauks, or little owl. Scholars are uncertain why owls figure so prominently as symbols of wisdom and as always being alongside both Athena and Minerva. In my view, it is too simplistic to argue, as some scholars have done, that the abundance of owls as symbols of wisdom is due to the fact that Athens, and especially the area of the Parthenon devoted to worshiping Athena, was home to many owls. As the goddess of wisdom, Athena is usually portrayed as bright-eyed, glaukopis, to symbolize her wisdom and power of vision. And here we already see a kind of affinity or parallel between the way that Athena looks like and the way that owls see. Similarly, the most striking feature of the owl is its large, dark eyes. Interestingly, while most birds have the eyes located on the side of their head, the owl's eyes, like that of humans, face forward. Could it be the case that the owl appeals to us because its perceptive looks are both mesmerizing in their familiarity and also in their animal otherness or foreignness? In contrast to humans, owls' eyes are more static, of course, and this lends to their attraction. Also, owls have the capacity to turn or twist their head for up to 270 degrees, which practically allows them not only to look behind, but also to look to the left by turning to the right, and vice versa. I'm not going to try to illustrate this here, because this is where the parallel between owls and human beings ends. As is well documented in classical works such as Aesop's Fables and Aristophanes' comedy The Birds, owls and other animals have captivated the philosophical imagination as well as the literary imagination. Scholars have argued that animals inhabit Aesop's fables because they were meant to be used to teach children important lessons for life for many generations. I think they're also quite popular here in Japan, some of these fables. According to this view, the animal presentations are simply anthropomorphic stylized depictions of certain human characteristics. For example, the fox is cunning, the lion is brave, the sheep is timid, and so on. Animal representations might allow easier identification for the children for whom many of these stories were written. However, this is, in my opinion, not a sufficient explanation for the abundant presence of animals in wisdom literature. Going back to our topic, we may say that Aesop's fables use animal characteristics in order to put the human perspective into perspective. Often this happens with a humorous or morbid twist that allows for a decoupling and a stepping back from our ordinary human perspective. Not rarely are the animals talking, which is already funny by itself, to have speaking animals. To take an example, in the fable The Owl and the Birds, which is recounted by, among others, Aesop and La Fontaine, so from classical Greek antiquity to the 17th century European literature, the owl tries to warn other bird species. In some versions of the fable, and this here is an interesting representation from the end of the 19th century by Kawanabe Kyosui in an edition of Fontaine's version in which this fable is also included about the owl and telling the other birds. In some version of the fable, the other birds are eagles. They are being warned by the owl about different kinds of danger. The owl warns other birds against natural as well as human traps and instructs the other birds how to avoid or diffuse these dangers early on. Of course, the other birds think that the owl is crazy and refuse to listen. When the owl itself, a predator bird, sees a man with a bow, it warns the other birds, quote, "This man will outstrip you with the help of your own feathers. For though he's on foot himself, he will send feathered shafts after you." So the feathered shafts are, of course, being made out of dead birds. And so it's the feathers themselves that allow the walking human person to shoot the birds. Again, the other birds do not listen. When they do learn to take seriously the owl's warnings, it is too late. When the owl is finally being recognized for its wisdom and foresight by other birds, it gives up providing advice and only complains from now on. It becomes a lamenting owl. The saying, "The eagle who is shot by his own feathers," advanced to become a commonly cited proverb. It suggests that one has been defeated by one's own means, and often due to one's own pride, preventing one from listening to valuable advice. The other day, I noticed that when one climbs up on Mount Daimonji, we also find a very interesting and also peculiar presentation of owl as a form of police owl or fire owl, you might call it. And this is a very interesting representation, I thought, because the owl warns humans not to smoke and thereby not to cause forest fires. As a very strict owl, it seems also to be rather funny. The owl is warning or policing humans. At the same time, the owl is an endangered species that is threatened by those it is warning. So we have this interesting circularity here. Returning to our topic, birds of wisdom appear throughout classical literature, probably also because people then were living much closer to nature than we are nowadays. Another example I would like to go to is Aristophanes' already mentioned comedy, The Birds, not to be confused with the Hitchcock movie, of course. The birds construct a city by the name of Cloud Cuckoo Land, a bird utopia that promises an escape from the harm caused by human beings. This safe haven also provides refuge for some Athenian citizens escaping from the endless boredom of philosophical and political debates about laws and wars and other matters that are considered important in Athens at the time. The birds do not claim to possess wisdom, but instead they muse upon eternal wisdom. As in the case of Aesop's fable, the comedy draws on birds to bring about a shift in human perspective. They mock the inherited religious and mythical knowledge and the tendency of humans to take their pursuits of wisdom all too seriously. Aristophanes is known to ridicule the presence of philosophical claims to wisdom in his plays, most famously the caricature of Socrates that we find in the comedy The Clouds. In contrast to human cosmologies, the origin of the bird universe, we learn from the talking birds, is to be found in an egg, and the birds born from love are superior to the unreliable and all too human and constantly fighting Olympian gods that the birds are presented as an alternative to. The birds are fully aware of the advantage of having wings, and in a kind of satirical tone of voice, the birds' chorus invites the human audience to engage in a thought experiment, a form of imagined role play or interspecies swap. And there the owls say, no, this I didn't put on, only fancy, dear spectators, had you each a brace of wings, never need you tired and hungry, add a tragic chorus stay, you would lightly, when it bored you, spread your wings and fly away, back returning after lunch to enjoy your comic play. So human beings are invited by the birds to imagine what it would be like to be as free as a bird. The thought of flying away whenever bored or hungry clearly seems appealing. The philosophical fascination with birds extends into modern times and has given rise to a debate about how to explain and interpret avian vocalization or bird song or bird speech in parrots and other birds. In his Critique of Judgment, the philosopher Immanuel Kant writes that many birds, including the parrot, the hummingbird, the bird of paradise, are free beauties themselves. We like them freely and on their own account. He continues, birdsong, which we cannot bring under any rule of music, seems to contain more freedom and hence to offer more to taste than human song, even when this human song is performed according to all the rules of the art of music, because we tire much sooner of a human song if it is repeated often and for long periods. So for Kant, human appreciation of natural beauty exceeds that of the appreciation of art beauty. And thus, writes Kant, when birdsong is imitated very precisely by a human being, as it's sometimes done with a nightingale's warble, it strikes our ears as quite tasteless. So imitated bird song does not really appeal to human beings. And when they find out that what they consider to be real bird song is in fact only either recorded or imitated by human beings, they are quite disappointed. Why does the bird song usually not annoy us, on the other hand? Kant states, a bird song proclaims his joyfulness and contentment with his existence, and further specifies, at least that is how we interpret nature, whether or not it has such an intention. End of quote. The interest in natural instances of, quote, free beauties themselves is higher than the importance humans attach to artificial objects, which might please our vanity and interest in decoration, but do not allow us to rejoice in the very existence of freedom in nature. Kant introduces a thought example to underscore our preference for natural over artificial music. When human beings parrot avian music, the result is, when being discovered, disappointing to the listener. We might add that when parrots speak, or to excuse the metaphor, ape human beings, the result is rather amusing on the other hand. What is important for Kant, though, is that the gap between humans and birds, between reason and nature, cannot be bridged. Even though some form of communication, or perhaps better, a sense of resonance with nature, is not only possible but inherently enjoyable. However, as Kant always makes clear, as long as we remain aware that we listen to the birds, but we do not listen as the birds listen, just as our singing is not at its most artistic when it resembles birdsong. One important difference is that whereas artistic creation and arguably also aesthetic appreciation requires long processes of discipline and cultivation, for humans, at least the appearance of effortless virtuosities that we perceive in animal behavior is only achieved after extensive periods of sustained and dedicated effort, while for birds it appears to arise naturally. Works of art appear as if natural, but are not natural. Effortless beauty without prior training is, if at all, left to the birds. In the history of Western philosophy, animals surface again and again, often in pivotal passages of classical text, where one would least expect them. This is perhaps most obvious in post-Kantian philosophy, especially in Hegel, who has for modern times made the Owl of Minerva once again so famous. In the opening chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit, dedicated to sense certainty, Hegel speaks of animal wisdom. This section is usually read, especially in Anglo-American circles, as an epistemological section in which Hegel refutes the view that sense experience can be adequately captured by way of language, as if our knowledge of the external world would be independent of one's practical engagement with this world. The reference to animal wisdoms are too often overlooked or dismissed as idiosyncratic asides that don't add anything to Hegel's arguments. And yet they are essential and find echoes in later parts of the text dedicated to the spiritual zoo or the spiritual animal kingdom, geistiges Tierreich, in which Hegel presents humans behaving like animals and vice versa, as if in an interspecies carnival. In the chapter on sense certainty, Hegel attributes animals with a sense of practical wisdom that is lost when adopting an overly abstract epistemology. In contrast to naive epistemological conceptions of claiming certainty about sense objects independent of our experience of them, animals have an immediate knowledge and practical grasp of the external world. Animals are not shut out from this wisdom, but on the contrary, show themselves to be most profoundly initiated into it. For they do not just stand idly in front of sensuous things, as if these possessed intrinsic being, but despairing of their reality and completely assured of their nothingness, they fall to without ceremony and eat them up. And all nature, like the animals, celebrates these open mysteries which teach the truth about sensuous things. Here's the quote. It is animals who, in devouring external objects as food, mock sense data epistemologists. They show that the proof of the pudding is not in epistemology, but in the eating. Animals prey, and digestion reveals a better understanding of the open mysteries that bread is not just bread and wine not just wine, but also nourishment, without a need for either special ceremonies or a fancy epistemology to prove this. Animals are not only introduced as examples of practical wisdom defying epistemology. One animal stands for, in particularly for philosophical wisdom, and can be considered perhaps Hegel's most semantically laden metaphor. Hegel's image of the Owl of Minerva has been the topic of much discussion over generations of interpreters. Here is the quotation from the preface to the lectures on the philosophy of right, in which the metaphorical owl, the ancient company of the goddess of wisdom, but also of death and the arts, accompanies Athena, or in Roman times, as we already said, Minerva. When philosophy paints its gray in gray, one form of life has become old, and by means of gray, it cannot be rejuvenated, but only known. The Owl of Minerva takes its flight only when the shades of night are gathering. So the owl metaphor seems to suggest that philosophical wisdom always comes too late on the scene. And there's a lengthy philosophical debate what Hegel exactly meant by this passage, and I will not have sufficient time to go through this. Also the different metaphors that he appeals to, like the gray and gray directly refers to the green and green that Goethe uses to characterize life. So I will not have time to go into the details, only it is interesting to notice that this metaphor has been so prominent of a reference point in many post-Hegelian thinkers. So, for example, it was Hegel's philosophical adversary, Schopenhauer, who radically reverses the image of the owl of Minerva. In contrast to Hegel, for Schopenhauer, the owl is not the bird of wisdom, rather it is a threat to the power of truth. The owl thrives in the darkness and lives off the refractive light of the moon rather than direct light from the sun. It is an emblem of the contagious force of error. And he writes, Schopenhauer writes, every error has a poison inside it. There are no harmless errors, and still less any worthy of reverence, any holy errors. Errors can indeed play its games in the night just as owls or bats do. Nevertheless, it is more likely that these owls and bats will chase the sun back into the east than that a truth, once recognized and clearly and completely expressed, could be driven back so that some past error could once again occupy its broad seat. And so the metaphor continues. Interestingly, here he already uses the image of the east and the west, and so this is a good transition because he argues that it's more likely that we find a different notion of wisdom in the east. Of course, Schopenhauer is known for his interpretation of Buddhism. Here's another way how this owl metaphor has been taken up in contemporary or modern philosophy. Here we have the 20th century systems theorist Niklas Luhmann, philosopher and sociologist, who in an also humorous way here says, we can now encourage the owl of Minerva to stop hooting in the corner and begin its flight into the night. Luckily, we have instruments to watch over it, and we know that its journey is a reconnaissance, a wiedererkennen of modern society. So here, interestingly, systems theory lets the owl fly, but it's also equipped with the right kind of technology in order to make sure that the course of the owl is correct and observed correct, which is the most important for Luhmann. So, interestingly, thus far we have only considered in an all too hazardous manner perhaps references to birds in the European tradition. It is surprising that birds are particularly prominent in the attempts to elucidate wisdom across different cultural traditions, though. A philosophical ornithology would need to trace the attraction that birds have had in the human imagination across cultural boundaries. Birds of wisdom, as well as other wisdom animal depictions, are prominent in all world civilizations. To illustrate this claim and to live up to the promise made in the subtitle of the talk, let me at least briefly mention a few examples from the Taoist classic, the Zhuangzi. So classical Chinese texts are extremely rich in animal imagery, and animals do play an important role when it comes to reflecting about wisdom, including reflecting about the limits of the philosophical pursuit of wisdom. The Zhuangzi alone mentions some 75 animals, including various mythological and hybrid animals. It is striking that the opening chapter starts with a transformation from the giant fish Kun to the phoenix Pang, which is, I did read, even though I have been maybe corrected by Abe Sensei, which is supposed to be similar to a Japanese mythological creature, and I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's written Hai Ryu. And more famous or maybe better known as Tobitatsu. So the Tobitatsu, which is a Nara or a dragon bird, is very similar in many respects to this bird Pang. that we find there, and also has this transformative power. Apparently some 50 kilometers from campus at the sea Okishima, there lives one version of it, namely the Ogonsho bird, which every 50 years rises out of the sea. And interestingly, in Japanese mythology, this seems to be not so much a bird of wisdom that one turns to in admiration and appreciation, but apparently it has a horrible scream that one doesn't want to come across. So this is an interesting transformation of mythical creature. The giant bird Pang has played an analogous role to the metaphor of the owl of Minerva in depicting the Taoist ideal of wisdom or great knowledge, which is not or only too well understood by the laughing cicada and the dove, who consider the excessive dimensions and the flight distance of Pang to be ludicrous when compared to their comparative small domains of flight. We encounter a number of other prominent birds and flying insects, such as the magpie and the famous butterfly. One can distinguish at least 4 modes, I think, in which animals are depicted to make a point about wisdom in the Zhuangzi. So one can distinguish sometimes these birds have the function of not really teaching, but in a way embodying practical wisdom and spontaneity. So these animals know how to intuitively and effortlessly move in their environment without wasting any kind of excess energies. Especially fish and birds are so important, and so I think the bird Pang, which before was a fish and can become a fish again, is a good example of this. Also, in terms of the discourse about wisdom, the plurality of different animals is extremely important, because animals as well as plants demonstrate the existence of multiple and sometimes radically diverse perspectives on how to live well. So cicadas, ants, trees, often very small and very big animals, which is also already part of the perspectivism. Human beings are invited to think in the very small and in the gigantic dimensions that usually middle-sized creatures that we don't consider so often. A third group of animal depictions, I think, demonstrates what I call humorous anti-wisdom. Animals are funny caricatures who ridicule the philosophical infatuation with wisdom. Especially monkeys and eels come up very often. Of course, the monkey across cultures is a very common symbol for human beings and aping their language or behavior. Wisdom of transformation is a fourth mode in which these animals surface. Like the bird Pang, these animals are subjects to transformation processes and move through different forms of life. So fish kun becomes bird Pang, or a caterpillar becomes butterfly, but also less biologically accurate depictions like human beings becoming roosters, where here we might also say it's also a form of humorous depiction. When we die, we become different parts of nature. Among them also our arm might become a rooster and has then these special capacities that we as human beings might not enjoy. So this is one example here where we can see this pluralism of perspectives, but also animal-human parody. Especially important is the latter half of this quote, I think, because Zhuangzi, just as Aesop, highlights the relativity of dwelling places as well as aesthetic standards between different species of animals, between individuals of a species, as well as between animals and humans, to make a point about the contextual conditions of aesthetic judgment and proper behavior. So here humans regard Mao Qiang and Lady Li, who must have been very beautiful in human eyes, as great beauties. But when fish see them, they dart into the depth. When birds see them, they soar into the skies. When deer see them, they bolt away without looking back. Which of these four knows what is rightly alluring? And often these stories leave the question open, because the point is that there is no way of deciding is the human standards of considering this person beautiful to be the ultimate standards, or should we rather be afraid of them like the fish or some birds flying away? Animals serve as reminders which illustrate that the very human pretension to wisdom is both foolish and quite comical once imagined from an animal perspective. The liberating aspect of using exaggeration and animal-human role play consists in freeing humans from the pretentious and self-contradictory desire to wanting to become wise. Not only the Confucian insistence on virtues such as wisdom, but also the Taoists are being ridiculed, so there's even a sense of self-ridiculing. For example, the Taoist desire for longevity, even the Taoist desire to ridicule, is being ridiculed. Just as in the case of Aesop's fables, in Zhuangzi the sense of humor is often what in German we refer to as Schadenfreude, a kind of mischievous or malicious joy at the suffering of others. And as the proverb has it, he who is the last one to laugh laughs the best. So we find laughing about laughter as well, kind of self-reflexive humor that is incorporated to even see that even an existence that is comical has to see where its blind spots and limits are if it wants to commit itself to the task of taking wisdom both not seriously and seriously. So to balance this radically humorous dimension, however, there's also an admiration of the spontaneity that animals reveal when acting in their natural habitat rather than being reified and alienated for ulterior purposes. Zhuangzi famously compares himself to a sacrificial turtle, arguing that the turtle dragging its tail in the mud is better off than the dead tortoise in the king's palace. When being asked whether he wants to take on a political job close to power, he says, no, of course, like the turtle, it's better to be alive and in the mud than being dead and in the palace. The reference to the turtle documents that the life of nature is, at least in some ways, often better to one oriented to reputation and rank in this particular parable. Animals had a particular role to play as models of what it means to live a spontaneous life that was focused on proximate experience rather than long-term planning and strategizing. What distinguishes the wisdom of animals from that of humans is that they are naturally or spontaneously self-so or free, while humans need to undergo a education process by learning how to forget the artificial features of cultivation again if they want to appear as virtuous in the sense of virtuosity, not in the moral sense. Animals do not have magical or spiritual powers. They are just what they are and do just what they do without humans fully understanding what they do when they do it and what they see when they see it. In this capacity as being familiar but also quite different, animals are a model of a wisdom without wisdom, or an anti-wisdom, we might say, since they act according to their nature without having to force themselves to become something different through moral education and hideous cultivation. So this here is, I think, one of the most elemental lines here. You have learned how to fly with wings, but not yet how to fly without wings. You have learned the wisdom of being wise, but not yet the wisdom of being free from wisdom or free of wisdom. And so this is a very crucial notion of the freedom from wisdom that is also stressed very often in this Taoist critique of the moral and cultivation discourse among their competitors, the Confucians, who were much closer to power, and the Taoists were in a way critical of these voices. So let me jump a little bit to the conclusion. By way of conclusion, let us ask, why is the animal and especially certain birds preferred symbols or prominent symbols of wisdom? What is it that makes birds seem like a welcome balance to human wisdom? Human beings are beings of lack. From a biological perspective, human beings are born prematurely and without feathers. As we already saw in the case of Aristophanes, a major reason to explain the fascination with birds is that they, in contrast to humans, are capable of flying. In each human there's a trace of the Greek mythical picture of Icarus. Icarus does not listen to the advice of his father Daedalus not to fly too high or too low to evade the heat of the sun, and not too high to evade the heat of the sun, and not too low to avoid the vapors of the sea, which would destroy the technology that lets Icarus fly as if he would be a bird. Humans are both incapable of and existentially drawn into the lure of natural flight. Prostheses such as airplanes can approximate, or like Icarus' wings, they can approximate, but they cannot really satisfy and fulfill this desire. Animals and birds in particular are what we often see and hear but do not completely understand, even if we find them fascinating. They are like witnesses of us who put into perspective our given perspectives and teach us to take less importantly our tendency to take human wisdom to be the most important of things. Birds fascinate, and we encounter them in attitudes ranging from wonder to anxiety. At the bottom of this fascination is the imagination of a vertical and at the same time effortless, gliding bird's eye perspective that is both suggestive and impossible to attain for human beings. The possibility of lifting off and effortlessly regarding the world from a top-down celestial perspective is qualitatively different from the experience of creatures whose movements are, for the most part, restrictive to walking on a horizontal plane and occasionally swimming or crawling. Humans are beings who are incapable of flying and whose vision is, for the most part, directed horizontally rather than vertically. Moreover, the owl in particular is appealing because it is equipped with night vision and can thus see what remains hidden from daylight, which also adds to the kind of anxieties we have. This constitutes the owl's mysterious but also often uncanny and visionary character that we see here in this 43rd Capriccio from Goya, and it's titled El sueño de la razón produce monstruos, or the sleep or the dream of reason that produces monsters. And so the owl here quite prominent, hovering over the sleeping reason of this poor fellow here. Contemporary philosophers have started to take the animal perspective more seriously in recent years. Thus, the American philosopher Thomas Nagel, for example, raises the question, what is it like to be a bat? Human beings do not have experimental insight into the experience of seeing like a bat sees, if one can at all speak of seeing for an animal that uses high-frequency sonar system. The bat emits sounds beyond our hearing range and interprets the echoes that will be reflected by objects within range to acquire a sense of orientation. This sense is rather distinct from our human sense of orientation, and our imagination is too limited to grasp what it would be like. As an acoustic phenomena, we might conjecture that the bat calls or hears what a room is like rather than seeing it. In short, we know that there must be some way in which it does feel, in some way which exists that feels to be like a bat, even though we will, as human beings, never know what it is for the bat. We can imagine what it might be like for us, but not what it would be like for this bat. ultimately, the bat remains for us, in spite of increasing biological knowledge, a fundamentally alien form of life, as Nagel says. How is our knowledge of an alien form of life that we know of but do not understand matter? So I will leave this as an open question, but instead of a conclusion, and in order to return to Minerva's owl, a brief reference to the visual arts could prove helpful. In addition to numerous other animals, Picasso had a profound artistic as well as personal appreciation for owls. He depicted them again and again and saw in the owl the bird of both wisdom as well as death, as well as violence. In Picasso's owls, the depicted owls often take on human form, or the humans take on the form of owls. Picasso himself, an odd Spanish Kauz, as we would say in German, a kind of oddball or crazy bird, frequently lived with rescued owls over extended periods of time. He even conversed with them and watched them prey on mice and small cats. This must have been particularly intriguing to him, to watch them prey these animals that sometimes Picasso then even contributed to by bringing in more mice and so on. His owl depictions masquerade the clear-cut boundary between animal and human existence. In these works, traditional anthropocentric perspectives are being reversed, and the spectator invited to imagine the animal as human and vice versa. In one photograph, it is not so clear who is imagining whom, Picasso his owl, or the owl Picasso, or perhaps the painted owl in the background, both Picasso as well as the adopted owl. It does appear that Picasso and the owl have a strikingly similar gaze, at any rate. The owl depicted on the left bears Picasso's photographed eyes, the owl here on the left, while the owl on the right is a statue of a gray owl is painted with a female face. On the base, one can read the words Carnival there, suggesting either that the owl is a mask for the woman, or the woman is a mask for the owl in this particular depiction. These works invite humans to rethink the tendencies of considering the pursuit of wisdom all too seriously, and to see it in a way as a carnival. Imagining animals as humans allows to decentralize the human perspective and thereby reveal the philosopher's blind spot. Thank you very much. ご清聴ありがとうございます。